Hello everyone, thanks for watching this video. I'm Rizzo, a PhD student advised by Dr. Wenye Wang in ECE Department of North Carolina State University. It's my great honor to present you our paper accepted by IEEE Globecom 2021, Temporal and Spectral Analysis of Spectrum Hole Distributions in an LTE Cell. In this paper, we analyze the spectrum hole distributions in both temporal and spectral domains based on high-resolution spectrum usage data. Here goes the outline of my presentation. I will first introduce the background, motivation, and the research question. Then I present how we collect high-resolution spectrum usage data and how they are analyzed in both the time and the frequency domains. In the third section, two well-known spectrum usage models are fitted to the data along both temporal and spectral domains for performance comparisons. The presentation is concluded in the fourth section. In the first section, I will introduce the background of spectrum tendency analysis and explain two important but still overlooked aspects. Then the research question is proposed. In traditional spectrum management, only a small portion, such as the ISM bands, are provided for non-exclusive usage, as shown in this figure. The rest of the spectrum resources are assigned exclusively, and they are intended to meet the peak requirements. Thus, more spectrum resources will be wasted when traffic becomes less. To make better use of the wasted spectrum resources, we need to measure and analyze how the spectrum holes are distributed. Though there have been many works on spectrum tendency analysis, two important aspects have been overlooked. The first one is the resolution of spectrum tendency data. As summarized in a survey paper, most of the spectrum tendency data has a time resolution of tens of seconds and the frequency resolution around 200 kilohertz. However, such resolution are too coarse for most spectrum tendency studies on cellular systems. As shown in the figure, if the resolution is too low, we will have wrong spectrum usage, which inevitably leads to wrong spectrum tendency analysis. Another issue is that existing spectrum tendency analysis examines the spectrum usage from the time domain. There are time domain models for a single channel, like this work, and there are time domain studies on multiple channels as well. However, little analysis has been conducted from the frequency perspective. The frequency domain of spectrum hole distributions is also an important aspect in spectrum resource analysis, which exerts substantial impacts on spectrum prediction and resource scheduling. To address the overlooked issues, in this paper, we answer how the spectrum holes are distributed in both temporal and spectral domains when examined at fine resolutions. The contributions are twofold. We, for the first time, discovered that the spectrum hole distributions are best captured by the power law in both temporal and spectral domains when examined in the same time frequency granularity as scheduling. Second, we compared the Markov and the on-off spectrum tendency models when they are fitted along the time and the frequency horizons. And we find that both models should be fitted in the spectral domain to achieve the best fitting results. Now let's move on to the second section, where I will explain how we achieve the high-resolution spectrum tendency and how the spectrum hole distributions are studied from both the temporal and spectral domains. Our study targets the spectrum usage of LTE systems. To obtain spectrum tendency data at the same time frequency resolutions with LTE scheduling, we use the decoding-based measurement tool proposed in our previous work. It is able to decode and parse the LTE downlink control information, where the assignments of spectrum resources for all users in the cell are announced. The measurement tool is a software implemented in the user space of a Linux desktop, and a universal software radio peripheral works as the radio front end. We gather spectrum tendency data of a commercial LTE cell near our lab. We first use a spectrum analyzer to find the LTE cell with the best signal and its frequency band. Then, the decoding-based measurement tool is tuned to the band. The system bandwidth of the cell is 10 MHz, which accommodates 50 LTE resource blocks, or RBs. We collect spectrum tendency in 24 hours, which contains over 4 billion binary spectrum tendency in the same resolution with LTE scheduling. Though the data is collected from one cell, we choose a day when the spectrum tendency data contains the most various traffic conditions out of 7 days. The spectrum usage levels in the day vary widely from 6% to over 90%. The most significant feature of the spectrum tendency dataset is that the resolution of the data is the same with the LTE scheduling, i.e., 1 millisecond by 180 kilohertz, which has far better granularity than other spectrum tendency studies. Here is a visualization of the two-dimensional perspective on spectrum hole distributions. We first study the spectrum hole distributions in the time domain, where we look into each LTE-RB and examine the time length of spectrum holes in milliseconds. In the temporal domain, we define the random variable xti and yti for spectrum hole time length and the separations between them, or off times and on times in channel I. We study the size of spectrum holes in terms of LTE-RBs by looking into the tendency in each millisecond along the frequency horizon. The definitions for the spectral domain is similar to those in the time domain. Random variable xf and yf for off and on sizes. The lowercase letters denote observed data samples, which are regarded as the instance of the random variables. Now, let's look at the temporal distributions of spectrum holes. When we plot probability mass functions of the sizes of the temporal spectrum holes and their separations in the log-log scale, we see a straight line, meaning that the distribution follows the power law. Thus, we fit the probability with the power law function with a constant term and achieve very close fitting result. Besides, another takeaway is that almost 43% of the off time and 42.5% of the on time are only 1 millisecond. So, high resolution measurement is important in that measurement with time resolutions longer than 1 millisecond cannot capture a significant part of the on-off time length. Next, we examine the temporal spectrum hole distributions in low, medium, and high traffic conditions, where 6, 5, and 89% of the RBs are occupied. We can observe from the figures that the size of spectrum holes becomes smaller as traffic intensity grows, and the probability mass function is still captured by the power law function with a constant. These figures show the temporal distribution of LTE spectrum holes in different frequency. Due to space limitations, the distributions of 3 RBs are plotted. RB5 in the low frequency end, RB25 in the middle, and RB45 in the high frequency end. The takeaway is that the temporal distribution of spectrum holes in different LTE-RBs are highly similar, and they all follow the probability mass of the power function with a constant. Now let's examine spectrum holes in the frequency domain. Their probability mass has regular fluctuations, but the overall contour can still be captured by the power law with a constant function. Let's see how the traffic intensity affects the spectral distribution of spectrum holes. According to these figures, the fluctuations of the probability mass of spectrum holes gets smoother when traffic intensity increases. In the third section, we study the different fitting performance of Markov and on-off spectrum tendency models when applied in the temporal and the spectral domains. Now, let's briefly introduce the two widely adopted models, the Markov and the on-off models. When Markov model is used, it is assumed that a number of spectrum usage in previous time slots form a state with which certain probabilities of the next tendency status are associated to be either on or off. For on-off model, the time lengths of the on and off periods are considered instances of random variables with the same distribution. When the two models are fitted along temporal and spectral horizons, the four fitted models are denoted as MF, MT, OF, and OT. When fitting in the frequency domain, the spectrum tendency is serialized along the frequency horizon. For Markov models, we assume that three previous tendencies form the states. For on-off model, the probability of the on-off times follow the power law function with a constant. After obtaining the four types of fitted models, we generate spectrum tendency data with these models and compare the cumulative distributions of the spectrum holes in the measurement data and the four synthetic data sets. Let's first look at the temporal spectrum distributions. In terms of the CDF of the temporal distributions of spectrum holes, on-off model fitted in the time domain is the most close to the measurement data. In terms of the spectral distributions, the on-off model fitted in the frequency domain achieves the most similar CDF with the measurement data. Now let's quantitatively compare the CDFs of the four models with that of the measurement. D values of the KS test is the upper bound between two CDFs, and the table summarizes the D-value comparisons of the four models. Based on this table, the summation of the D-values in a row are smaller when the models are fitted to the spectrum holes in the frequency domain, which is true for both on-off and the Markov models. Fitting on-off model to the spectrum holes in the frequency domain achieves the smallest total D-values. Now let's conclude the findings in this work. We discovered that the spectrum hole distributions of LTE spectrum tendency can be best described by the power law function when examined at the same time frequency resolution with scheduling. Based on the comparison studies of the Markov and the on-off models fitted in the temporal and the spectral domains, we find that fitting along the frequency dimension achieves smaller overall D values. This is the end of my presentation. Thanks again for watching this video, and thank you for your interest in our paper.